Okay, looks like we have enough people to get us going. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miguel Angel Vasquez. I am a member of the American Planning Association, as you know, and my affiliation is also with the California Planning Roundtable in our local California chapter. I want to welcome you to our second webinar, which is part of a series of webinars addressing our chapter's response to the LA fire in surrounding areas. And I am welcoming you on behalf of our current APA California President, Gary Fernandez, and also on behalf of the working group that is organizing these webinars to be able to assist our communities during these very difficult times. I am very pleased to see, I was looking at the CAL FIRE website, and all fires are under control. They have been contained. That is really, really good news. And also, I'm looking up in the sky, and we have some cloud cover that is bringing us some rain, which is another aspect that we need to think about, and hopefully we can get into that conversation today. But with that, I want to also acknowledge that all of you who are going through the rebuilding process, we're thinking about you, we are with you, and we are working to the extent possible to assist you from our capabilities as professional urban planners. There's many, I would say, movements or efforts underway by other disciplines, by other organizations, from the private, from the nonprofit, from the public sector, and so on and so forth. And moving forward, you will be hearing from us the kinds of things that we are hearing on the ground. And all of this is going to be converging. Actually, it's just starting to happening. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator for today, whose name is Mark Roberts. He's our treasurer at the California Planning Roundtable, and he is also a past city manager for the city of Livermore. And with that, Mark, if you could please take it away.
Thank you, Miguel. Appreciate that a bunch. Today, we're going to be talking with Pete Parkinson. Pete is an AICP, and he worked as a professional planner for more than 35 years. He was the Sonoma County Planning Director from 2002 to 2013 and served as the APA California Chapter President in 2017 and 2018. And natural disasters have been part of his professional portfolio wherever he went, from landslides to coastal flooding and the Loma Prieta earthquake in Santa Cruz County to floods and wildfires in Sonoma. So, Pete, I want to start off by saying, is it you? I mean, because that's quite a list of disasters. Was it? Did you actually personally cause those, or were you just attracted to places that were prone to disaster?
Well, I was the environmental coordinator in Santa Cruz County, so I do take some responsibility for that. But it's just a good reminder that we all live in California, right? And these kinds of natural disasters are a fact of life. So I just want to start, I think, maybe by giving a little bit of a very, very quick overview of what we went through here in Sonoma County in 2017, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the takeaways, because I have a little bit of a unique perspective because I was a consumer of recovery services because our home burned and we had to rebuild it. But also, obviously, I was the planning director before the fire, and I was the APA president at the time of the fire, and was very connected still with the planning community. And I just want to say how it's really great to be here too, because I wish I could see you all out there in the audience, because I know some of you, but it's good to be here anyway. So in October 2017, we had a windstorm, not as intense as you all experienced down there in Los Angeles, but still we had a wind-driven firestorm, multiple ignitions. that blew into Sonoma County and the city of Santa Rosa. Ended up destroying 5,300 homes in Santa Rosa and in the unincorporated area. 22 people lost their lives. It was just horrific, and almost all of it happened in a single night. And so we were, as a community, as professionals here in Sonoma County, kind of thrown into this incident that had a magnitude that was unlike anything that people had really thought about or planned for there. So what I thought I would do is try to give some reflections on what I observed and thought about kind of in the, and took away from the early days right after the fire, kind of where those of you who are in the LA area right now, you're still very much in the middle of this. And then I'm going to sort of jump out a few more months and look at, what it looked like there. And then we're going to talk a little bit about taking the much longer view and preparing for the next fire, sadly, because that's really is our reality here. And kind of this, just looking at these early days post-fire, I really want to acknowledge the difficulty and how hard this work is. The recovery work, for those of you who are working in it, the recovery work is really demanding. And the sad fact of it is that it's going to remain that way for longer than you think. It is a marathon, but it's also a sprint too. You're going to be forced to sprint, especially in the early days. And there are going to be times throughout this process when you're going to have to get up and sprint again. My first experience with this was with the Loma Prieta earthquake in Santa Cruz County. I was the environmental planning manager there, and it ended up upending my professional and my personal life for nearly 2 years. So you got to pace yourself. And, the other lesson from this immediately was local staff is going to need contract help to handle recovery and rebuilding workload. You just can't do it on your own. Setting up dedicated recovery permitting centers is really essential for a catastrophe of this magnitude. There are plenty of models out there for how that works. They're very, very important. But I think it's also really important that you folks that are there working on it take care of yourselves, because the trauma is real and is really going to impact the agency staff and anybody else who is working with the public to facilitate recovery. Because working with people who have been through a trauma is very difficult and it's very taxing. So don't play the tough guy or person and just try to get your way through it. You have to really take some time out for yourself, get help, get your agencies to bring in people to help you deal with the psychological aspect of it, because it's very, very real. So the second observation about these early days is that, and Jeff touched on this 2 weeks ago, is that local governments here really stood up fast and they stood up strong. And it was really important. So like LA, we had thousands of structures destroyed in the city of Santa Rosa, thousands of structures destroyed in the unincorporated area. And the two agencies, the county and the city, worked together really to create kind of a seamless public-facing process in information point. And I want to emphasize a point that Jeff made a couple of weeks ago, which is this quick policy decision about rebuilding. People are going to be able to rebuild here. I think there's legitimate debate to be had around that and discussion about it. But at the end of the day, I've totally come to the conclusion that it is the only politically feasible decision on that issue in a crisis like this.
So Pete,
yeah.
So Pete, on that front, there's obviously a difference between allowing people to rebuild more or less in the same location and more or less the same structures that they had before. But clearly there's quite a bit of room to do surgical upgrades to access, to essentially do resiliency, both what's absolutely required and then thinking about, ways that we can sort of take that next step to do it a little bit better. So clearly the state code in most cases will have changed from the moment these structures were originally built. Yet, right, even with those updates, we have best practices that we're all collectively aware of, but the code writing process takes 3 years at a minimum. 6 years is pretty typical. So we're behind. We're 2 or 3 disasters behind on that. So from that perspective, was there anything you learned as a homeowner as you thought about this? That, okay, I'm not absolutely required to do this, but boy, people are saying this is a really good best practice as I'm starting to think about what I want to rebuild?
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of a couple of things. One has to do with landscaping and defensible space. As a homeowner with an existing home, I didn't think that much about defensible space. Should have, as it turns out, but I didn't. But I think that learning about that, how defensible space works, how fire works, and building some of those defensible space features into your new landscape plan around your home is very, very important. And then the other one was really a community initiative, sort of making these new buildings, to the extent possible, kind of more climate resilient. So we have here in Sonoma County, we have a community choice aggregator that provides low carbon or carbon-free electricity using PG&E's grid. And they put together an incentive program called Advanced Energy Rebuild that gave people cash rebates. We ended up getting $7,500, I think. And believe me, that helped. If you go mostly or all electric in your home, you get a heat pump, you install an EV charger and things like that. So those were a couple of things that were really, I think, very, very valuable there.
Well, and clearly you said even what some people would consider relatively modest amounts of money can make behavioral choices or make it a little easier for people to do what they wanted to do anyway. And thinking about those at the local level, what are those fairly modest programs, or what partners can we partner with? Yours, in case, was your energy provider partner there, to sort of take that next step. One of the things we've heard over and over again is wooden fences right up against the buildings are a bad idea. They literally allow things to move from building to building to building. What incentives could we give to, deal with those sorts of things, or regulation? And that's really the question. Sometimes regulation's the right answer. Sometimes incentives are the right answer, depending on how we're protecting the neighborhood here.
Well, I mean, I think as it relates to defensible space, certainly in the state responsibility areas, I don't know how that lays out down there in LA in terms of these fire areas, but it's going to be a requirement. It is absolutely going to be a regulatory requirement. So yesterday, the governor signed an executive order that told the Board of Forestry within 45 days, they have to publish the draft regulations to implement this new Zone 0 defensible space concept, which is having nothing that is flammable within 5 feet of your house. And obviously there's regs to develop around that, but that's coming. It's been in the statute, I think, for several years now. And these are tough regulations to write, and it's been going kind of slowly, but the governor told him to publish it within 45 days. And then also asked the state fire marshal to come up with new fire hazard severity zones for the local agency protection areas. But really in those local agency protection areas, it's going to be up to the local governments to decide what they want to do in defensible space. And this kind of gets to something that was one of the longer term lessons from my experience here, because the city of Santa Rosa and the county of Sonoma handled that aspect of it a little bit differently. So the county of Sonoma avoided really having strong mandates for landscaping plans with new rebuild proposals. The city of Santa Rosa was a little bit more rigorous around that. They're different environments for sure, and I can understand the reasons behind that. And I have to say, as a homeowner, it was, when I was wanting to get my rebuild permit, it was kind of nice not to have to come up with a landscape plan as well. But I also paid attention to what the defensible space requirements were and acted accordingly.
Good.
All right. The other thing you touched on, I think, was like, who do you turn to for this? And that was one of the other things that I thought from this kind of initial period right after the disaster that was so important, which is a lot of community based and groups and initiatives stood up, and that happened often organically. So you had neighborhood scale efforts that were incredibly valuable. You may have heard of this organization called Coffee Strong here in Santa Rosa. So, you know, Coffee Park was an area right in the middle of Santa Rosa, your basic kind of cookie cutter suburban subdivision that lost 1,400 homes. And those neighbors got together, advocated for themselves, helped themselves, and they were amazing, just amazing. And then the city council and the board of supervisors both found ways to plug into kind of hyper local communities. We had these block captains kind of model here, where these were neighborhood scale folks, neighborhood level folks who were able to meet with the council members and meet with the board members on a regular basis, start out once a week right after the fires, to give them feedback about what you need.
Got it. All right, you were on your way through the story, talking a little bit about what happens in the first days. So
yeah. Well, just one other thing on that, which is, and my guess is that the folks that are down in LA have already figured this out, but it really became apparent very fast that the early recovery and rebuilding efforts are not really planning centric efforts. They focus on engineers, architects, and building officials. And I know you guys are planning to bring some of those folks in, but that's really important. So, but even though it's not a replanning effort, planners do, I think, have essential skills in public engagement, interdisciplinary organization, and process facilitation that are just so important in a time like this. So you got to find the people who have those strong facilitation and empathetic skills, and you got to put them out front. And while this was a little bit frustrating at first, in terms of, trying to find the role for planners, it does grow over time. And so, one of the team members for this effort is Hanson Hom. And, he was just telling us last week about how he and Tom Jacobson are finishing up a CPAT project for the 2021 Dixie Fire up in Plumas County. And so, those longer term planning efforts do come into play, but they take a while.
Well, and the nice thing is that was just published. So if people are interested in getting a copy of that now is available just in time. I mean, the sad news on this is, there's always going to be a next time on some of these things.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to talk about what some of the obstacles were, and this is kind of shifting now a little more to a few months in here as people start wanting to get busy with their rebuilds and whatnot. There are some real obstacles that showed up here for us. One is, and I know you all know about this down there, is it is a massive debris removal and site cleanup effort, and it's going to be months before any real rebuilding can start, because it's just a massive logistical thing to put in place, huge challenges, and I think that it's a difficult first step for folks to get over, because you spend literally months waiting. It was 4 months after the fire, I think, before our property got cleaned up. Another one is pervasive underinsurance. It seemed like nobody had enough money for rebuild, which is related to the next big obstacle, which is that labor and materials are going to be in short supply and extremely costly. And I can remember now, in the 6 months to a year after the fire, several of my neighbors say, well, I'm going to wait 3 years before I rebuild, because the high demand now is going to push prices up and they'll come down over time. And it just hasn't happened. It's gone the other way. It's just continue to get more and more expensive. Traumatized homeowners is another issue. People, they don't know where to start. You got all these literally thousands of property owners who are now forced to be kind of small-time developers and figure out their development process. They get decision fatigue because there are so many decisions, including the rebuild or don't rebuild decision. And so, it can be real hard. Infrastructure issues were important too. here in Santa Rosa, they had issues with PVC water pipes burning and the combustion products going into the water mains and ending up contaminating them. It ended up being an $8 million price tag to fix that. But at least I think that utility folks know that that's something to look at now. Production builders, another really important part of the recovery here in Sonoma County, especially in the city of Santa Rosa. Little different out in the county areas because there's a lot of hillside development and it's just a little bit more challenging. But bring them into the tent early. They can help you come up with solutions for people. And in places like Coffee Park, they were just essential to getting that neighborhood back on its feet. Charitable foundation. Yeah.
There are clearly some areas that were production built that were affected by this disaster. And, that's where you can get some real economies. But that's a process. In other words, first of all, thinking about, I might get something that's slightly different than the home I had. Do I want to do that? Do I want to cooperate in such a way? Because of course it only works if a large number of folks in a relatively discrete area sort of want to play. It doesn't have to be everybody, but it certainly can sort of bring up options. So introducing those concepts, both by getting somebody into the tent to help play on the production side, and to start talking about that, with those who are going to be making those decisions. That's an important piece because sometimes you have to have a little time to mourn what isn't there anymore before you can start to think about anything other than I'd like it back just the way it was the day before the fire happened.
Right. Well, and I think, having production builders get involved also helps with some of the decision fatigue that people have, because what they did was come up with, a set of floor plans like production builders often do. And so it kind of limits you don't have to go with these guys, but if you do, they've got some options for you that are kind of self-contained and can really help move that decision process along.
And so your point about coordinating with neighborhood groups, encouraging those neighborhoods to have groups so that we can deal with it, because debris collection and removal, the production building, all of those work way better if there's coordination by the actual property owners at the block level, because to come in and do debris removal works way better if the whole area, the whole block is ready to go at once. And in fact, they won't do you if somebody else has a block that's ready to go. And so, one thing to sort of message and to be clear about is, one of the ways to help yourself move through this process is to be working with your neighbors, forming bonds there, and to the extent you can, presenting a unified front in your little area, because that will move you closer to the top of the list, although it will be way longer than you'd like it to be.
Right. And there are small things that can be done along those lines as well that can be really important. So in this subdivision, Coffee Park subdivision, you couldn't tell where property lines were anymore because everything's gone, right? And so the city actually did a property line survey there in order to just sort of take that off the table in terms of it being something that neighbors had to do. And I think that coordinating with Coffee Strong on that was really important. Here in our neighborhood, which is a neighborhood of 135 more or less homes, we worked with a soils engineer, geotechnical engineer, to come up with kind of a neighborhood scale geotechnical report with some customization that really it was economical, and it really helped speed up the process there.
Yeah, any way you as local government can facilitate folks working together, any step that you could take as the local government that just so people don't have to do 10 different individualized things right side by side doing it once, like the surveying work is just a fantastic one. Any utility level work that you can do just a little extra on the utility side just to get people one half step closer. Any of those things are great things for us to be thinking about, coordinating with all of the partners who do this. There's a boatload of silos in most governmental organizations, reaching out and doing our collective very best to coordinate across those boundaries. And you talked about the recovery center standing up. That actually is a fantastic model to use for this reaching across the jurisdictional or departmental boundaries to help people get through, because people don't care. people see us as the government, even if it's not even the city or the county. You know, it's a utility. So the more we can work together to get people to the right place and provide incentives to get them to a more resilient place. You see, there's some stuff popping up in the chat about assets that are already out there, rebuilding for resilient recovery, planning in California's wildland-urban interface. A lot of us, of course, were taught that the first block or 2 or 3 or 4 blocks, you know, so the first half mile was sort of the wildland-urban interface. And of course, we really know that's about a 5-mile interface. You know, because by the time you sort of get a wind-whipped event and you get the first level of embers going, and those embers go from a half mile to a mile further down, you know, you can be what we would normally consider a long way from that interface. I mean, people always said, oh, it can't ever jump a freeway. You know, that freeway is, you know, half a mile across with all of its various lanes. And of course, we know that's nonsense. So for some of us who sort of started our training in resilience maybe a few decades ago, we've learned a little since then. And usually there's a lot more areas that are exposed. There's a lot more essentially areas that we need to think about as being in that interface.
Yeah. And I think, you know, you mentioned resilience there, Mark, and one thing that is very important to emphasize has to do with housing. And providing adequate housing is an essential resilience measure in communities, because if you want to reduce the level of exposure to your growing population, or you're in an area, you got to find places to build housing that aren't as exposed, right? And so building in densification in urban areas, and I know that this is a major initiative in most of LA, so you guys are doing this, it seems to me. Right. But it's really important. But here in Sonoma County, for example, we started looking for opportunities to do that. So my mother-in-law, which was going to be our evacuation plan, my mother-in-law lived in a mobile home park with 160 other trailers in Santa Rosa that ended up being destroyed in the fire. And so on that site, our local nonprofit affordable housing developer came in and rebuilt 160 senior affordable apartments to replace those. They go up and not out. And now there's a market rate developer who's developing another 240 some odd apartments on that site. So it's a real opportunity to do something about housing shortage as well.
Well, the other piece is occasionally, you know, a fire will move through an area that was a too small, defunct old neighborhood shopping center that wasn't performing very well to begin with. And although it's a tough discussion to have, depending on the property owner there, those are opportunities as well, especially if those properties were well along that decline curve. You know, does it make sense to put commercial back in that if what was actually on it was underperforming? Now, we've got to be careful about how we do that so we just don't disproportionately impact certain populations as we're thinking about those thoughts. But those sometimes are opportunity sites in a devastation area as large as this. This wasn't just all houses, although we lost an enormous number of houses. Yeah. And private property owners are already going to be having these thoughts. And so we as planners sort of need to be ready when that person pops into the counter and sort of starts to talk about what other options are available to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was just in the northwest part of town the other day and reminded that one of the commercial buildings that was lost here was the Kmart, speaking of declining commercial establishments. And that site is still undeveloped.
Yeah. And part of that is, you know, obviously private property owners can do what they want with things, but us at least doing our homework on our side of the line makes a big difference there. So you were talking a little bit about, you know, NGOs and how they impacted sort of the middle time section here. Other thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, I just one other to mention, which is that one of the NGOs that stood up here in this middle period was an outfit called Rebuild North Bay. Mm-hmm. And it was incorporated as a 501c3. and they were looking at trying to get money to help people with rebuilding, help people with vegetation management, clearing the landscape, and that sort of thing. And out of that, after a couple of years, grew an organization called After the Fire USA, which I know has already come down and done at least one webinar, I think, for neighbors in the Pacific Palisades area. But now this is a pretty, it's still Sonoma County home is their home, but they are an organization that goes to any and all communities that are impacted by wildfire and works with the homeowners there and with the property owners there to find out what they need and how they can facilitate moving forward with recovery. They've done amazing advocacy work. So that's another sort of thing that really got fairly big, fairly quick in our area.
So Pete, one of the things that we said in the title here is that the past is prologue. So if that is true, and we are taking sort of that longer vision role, in theory, it's sort of right there in our professional name as planning for the future. What are some thoughts that you have about that longer time frame?
Well, first is just to recognize that the fire's going to come again, perhaps even in the same area. So after the 2017 fire here, everybody was just aghast to see these maps that showed up in the newspaper with the footprint of the 2017 fire overlaid with the footprint from a 1964 fire, almost the same. The big difference was that there was now a whole lot more development in that 2017 footprint. So, you know, and here in Sonoma County, we had the 2017 fires. We had major fires in 2019 and 2020 as well, some of which burned into areas that had already burned in 2017. So, and as we know, it's going to get worse. We're going to have more fires. The climate is driving part of this. And we also have extensive development in the actual defined wildland urban interface and more vulnerable populations. So it really is something that we're going to have to contend with. And one of the realizations that I came to after the fire here was to realize that hubris had kind of played a larger part in the situation than I really thought. And I think that both planners and fire officials were both somewhat guilty of thinking that the hazard could be managed. So, you know, for a long time, for years and years, the approach was based on these fire safe standards that are in the California Public Resources Code that deal with things like sort of nominally defensible space, road widths, turning radius, water supply, water storage, and this kind of stuff. But it's an approach that's based on fighting the fire. And in a firestorm like you all have experienced in LA, fighting that fire is not the answer. And I think it's increasingly not going to be the answer. And so we have to figure out ways to live with fire. And so, you know, that's why I say that, you know, both planners and fire officials, I think for years, were thinking, well, we'll just fight these fires when they come along and we can kind of manage it with a business as usual approach. But I think we were wrong. So just last Sunday here in our local newspaper, there was a article that originated in the New York Times. I just want to read the headline here, which is "Typical Playbook Failed in LA Fires." And I saw that, and I thought, oh my God, it's the same thing that we went through here in 2017. Because I talked with fire officials here, fire chiefs in this area after the fire, and they said, you know, we thought we had planned for the worst case scenario here in our drills and our exercises, but what we experienced was so much worse. And I go back and look at, I found a 10-year-old community wildfire protection plan for the city of Santa Rosa that identified virtually all of the areas that burned in 2017. But what it didn't envision was that they would all go off at the same time. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about when I said we have to kind of expand our vision of this and figure out how we're going to live with that kind of reality there. And I think part of that is planners educating themselves about how wildfire works. What does wildfire vulnerability look like? What factors are relevant? Somebody, I think, in a comment referenced, planning in the WUI area. There's an excellent 2019 Planners Advisory Service report called "Planning in the Wildland Urban Interface." It's not California specific, but it's tremendously helpful. And it was one of the lead authors there was Molly Mowery, who is one of the principals at the Community Wildfire Planning Center in Colorado. And this is what they do. They help planners understand how fire works, how they can influence community design to have more resilient communities. So I think that that's part of the lesson here is finding wildfire experts and bringing them in to the planning efforts that we're doing for education purposes, and just to think about design and think about the layout of communities going forward.
For most of us, we've been taught to think about different natural disasters very differently. Floods only happen in highly flood-prone areas. Wildfires only happen in an extraordinarily narrow band right up against the wildland interface. And I think realistically, going forward, many of these disasters are going to be much more like earthquakes. Nobody sort of says we're going to move out of, the state with earthquakes. That's not a reasonable way to deal with that. We understand that fundamentally we'll have to build the things that we're going to put into these areas differently. And we're going to have to expect that when the thing happens, thousands of buildings will be impacted by this. Now, that's how we plan for earthquakes. We expect the earthquake to hit the whole town, and we build structures in a way to deal with those things to at least lessen the loss of life. We've chosen to live, near a tectonic plate movement, and so that's what we all sort of bought into. I think we have, as you said, been fooling ourselves to think that somehow wildfire is somebody else's area or somebody else's danger or somebody else's issue to deal with. And your statement that you made a little while ago, that the best indicator of having your house impacted by fire in the future is that it was impacted once. My guess is if we looked back 100 years, we would find that some of these same areas have burnt before, except in times when we didn't care because they were truly wildland. But the wind doesn't change that much. The mountains don't change that much. The overall weather, while intensifying, the basics are set up long ago. And so from that perspective, especially as we're talking with our folks about rebuilding, they need to have that in their mind, that at some point, maybe not during their lifetime, but at some point, this area will be impacted by that exact same danger. How do we deal and make that impact as modest as possible when that happens?
Right. Well, I mean, I can give you one example from my own neighborhood. Speaking of NGOs, is that after the fire, we formed a 501c3 here in my neighborhood for the express purpose of becoming eligible for grants to do vegetation management. Mm-hmm. And we've done an incredible amount of work, and the neighborhood is very different than it was before the fire, but I think we're a lot more resilient and a lot safer. And so you're seeing these fire-wise communities and other efforts at a sort of neighborhood or sub-regional kind of scale to help deal with that. And I think that's a good place to focus back on and just remind ourselves about the importance of defensible space, not just around individual structures, but really looking at that on a landscape scale, right? So, our neighborhood's right next to a state park, and the fire came through the state park with this sort of horribly overgrown Doug fir forest there, and then roared into our neighborhood. Well, CAL FIRE and state parks have been working the last few years, in particular, really pretty aggressively and impressively to reduce the fuel load in that park, doing shaded fuel breaks. They've been doing controlled burns and whatnot in the park. And that is the kind of thing that we're going to need to be focusing on to make our entire landscape more resilient for the future.
Well, one of the things is sort of Cal Fire's Zone 0. Talk just a quick minute. What is Zone 0?
Zone 0 is the area between 0 and 5 feet from the structure. And so I was just this morning looking at the city of South Lake Tahoe's fire code as it relates to Zone 0. And it says that no flammable vegetation can be in that area. They said certain herbaceous plants like lawns and maybe succulents or something like that can be in there, but their ideal, as they portray it in this ordinance, is to have what they call a gravel moat around your property, 3-inch deep gravel moat. It gets to your point, Mark, about the fences too, and other wood appurtenances that attach to the building because they're pathways for fire.
So every, growing up, my town suffered a major earthquake. It was the city of Coalinga that devastated over 1,000 houses. Actually, 1,500 houses were unlivable right after it. And this is in a town of 6,000 people. So that's a huge percentage of folks who couldn't walk back into their homes. And whether it's an earthquake, like in Santa Cruz, or wildfires that you've been involved in, normally the communities that are hit the hardest are those who had the fewest resources to start with. That's a community of color, a low-income community, the communities that had been historically disadvantaged, sometimes by our very own regulations as planners due to redlining or other things. And were there any programs or first of all, did you observe this during the rebuilding challenges that you went through? And were there any steps that any of the communities you worked with take to try and mitigate some of those impacts? Because we know they're coming.
I guess the honest answer to that is that it was not real strong in that regard. But part of that, though, I think had to do with the nature of the wildfire disaster here, because it did hit a lot of sort of low density custom home kind of subdivisions or, rural residential subdivisions that are not low income places. And so I think that's where a lot of the impact was. Had it gone into some of the areas, along Highway 12 towards the town of Sonoma or into the southwest part of the city of Santa Rosa, it would have been a really different situation. And not to say that these vulnerable populations were not impacted at all. I think they were, but most of the focus was on rebuilding for homeowners. And like I say, I don't think that, I think there are it's an area for improvement, I guess I would say. And that's one of the things that the Rebuild North Bay Foundation really tried to focus on as well, is really being of service to those communities.
And having a vision for sort of how to do that, I think, is an excellent thing for the profession to be focused on. Some of those people weren't homeowners at all. And so how do we as a profession create, guideline standards, tools, even, publicize those sorts of programs that have worked in the past so that when we ultimately are building back, we're building back a complete community, not just the part of the community that had significant resources. And even, of course, we know even those parts of the community will be impacted because, as you noted earlier, most people are underinsured, certainly against what it's going to take to rebuild after an event like this, where everything's going to be more expensive. And unfortunately, from your experience, almost permanently.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think renters are particularly impacted because a lot of renters don't have renter's insurance. And so there were heartbreaking stories here about renters who literally lost everything and they weren't insured. And those folks need the most help getting back on their feet. And I do just want to sort of return to a point we talked about earlier about true resilience at the community level means having enough housing that people can afford so that there are options for them after a disaster like this. So there's one other thing I just, and then I'll shut up and we can get to more questions if you want, is in terms of looking towards the future, I just would encourage folks to really stay active in legislative efforts. This is so important. I think APA California has always done a great job with this. and they continue to. But we've had bills over the last several years to discourage new development in high wildfire areas. They've either been defeated or vetoed by the governor. But that effort remains really important. There's big pushback from housing advocates who perceive additional restrictions in fire hazard areas as sort of a NIMBY excuse not to build housing. And there's probably some truth to that in some communities, but I think we have to figure out a way to get past that. And I would expect, since we have a crisis now, and no good politician likes to let a crisis go to waste, that we'll see some proposals that we can work on. But stay tuned into those and provide your input, because we'll all be living with the result eventually.
So Eric writes, question about any insights on whether planning ahead for recovery makes sense, and should we be doing it in our communities? Pre-disaster recovery planning guidance is available from FEMA and Cal OES. And it seems we're learning that figuring out recovery during and after a disaster is too late. Miguel, you have thoughts on that one as well?
Not I just wanted I wanted to flag it for you.
Thank you, sir. So Pete, thoughts on that one?
I understand the difficulty of that, absolutely. I think one of the big challenges is expanding our vision to encompass what recovery in a catastrophic event like this truly looks like. Because I guarantee you that none of the people who do response planning or even fire protection planning thought that this would be what they would be facing. It certainly wasn't the case up here in Sonoma County, and I would be shocked if that was the case down there in LA as well. So that's the first step, is like, okay, what really are we dealing with here? What is the range of possibilities? And then you can start to do recovery planning, and you can have, I've seen some jurisdictions develop recovery ordinances that they've got sitting on file that they can trot out and have their legislative body approved to get things moving quickly. There are models for these resiliency permitting centers. There are models for how shelters work, and all of the different kind of local assistance centers and things like that that you need after a disaster like this. But I will also say that there are some things that are just out of our control, like insurance, for example. Local governments don't have control over that, and it is an increasingly dire situation for people who live in areas that could be impacted by wildfires. It's not just the true interface anymore. It's people who live in town that are having trouble getting insurance. And so you have a major catastrophe hit, like it will be when there's a major earthquake. You're going to have a lot of uninsured and underinsured people, and that just knocks the community back on their heels.
One of the things I think people are going to find as they rebuild and think about getting insurance is that their insurance company is going to be far harder on them than their local government as far as defensible space. I have heard multiple tales of literally having the insurance adjuster at time of renewal look at an aerial photo, off of Google Maps and say, you've got a half a dozen trees that have to come down, or we're not going to reinsure you. And so I think during rebuilding and ongoing, the insurance industry is going to be much more assertive and aggressive about doing that. One of the things, of course, that we all, as disaster workers, we go through the disaster drill. And then the time frame for those drills, which some of us have gone through dozens or hundreds of times in our career, ends within days or weeks, of the initial scenario there. And we really don't do any practicing for what we would literally do. As unrealistic as that is to do when you're developing those pre-ordinances or going through role playing and teaching and learning, but actually just putting that in the standard toolbox. I mean, I think, most of our disaster recovery comes from those first responders, and it's been extended to include, all of us. but really, drilling on that once a year about how would we stand up a, single stop recovery center? Who would we work with? How would we get people in the room? Do we have the contacts that we need to take those first steps? Because it does seem like it's part of a full life cycle of buildings, because most buildings are going to be impacted by disaster of some kind, during the 100 or 200 years that they stand, and acting like that's not the case doesn't mean it won't happen.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, for sure. But I also think it's important to recognize that every time one of these disasters happens, we learn something. So, one of the things that I have seen here in Sonoma County, for example, since 2017, is that I feel like our community is far more prepared. The communication systems and the warning systems are far more robust than they were in 2017, and the interagency communication in terms of emergency response, much better than it was.
Yes, absolutely. We've touched on a number of the questions in the chat there, and we are trying to wrap up very tightly at about 3 o'clock today. And I think all of you know, but we'll mention it one more time. These sessions are recorded, and they are placed on the AAPA California website, along with other resources. There are a lot of fantastic resources out there if you are looking to, because your community has been directly impacted, or if you're just trying to be slightly proactive and looking before your particular community has this sort of an impact. Those are great resources to look at. The best time to prepare is before you need to know that stuff. One of the other things we want to talk a little bit about is we will, over the next few weeks, be having some other folks come in. In several weeks, we're going to be talking about, actually what does resiliency look like on a building in particular? What sorts of things are both the code requiring, and then even more importantly, what are best practices on that front, by bringing in some folks who are experts in that area. The mental health impacts of this, because this is a community-wide mental health crisis as well as a physical crisis out there. And Miguel, let's see, we've got some other folks out there. Rob, are you out there? Tell us a little bit about one of our upcoming events. There we go. Let's see. I think you're unmuted, Rob. Let's see.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, and I don't see how I can put my camera on, but I guess.
I don't think you can, because you're out in participant land there. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about when your session is and what it's going to be talking about?
Yeah, so this is going to be in 4 weeks, March 7th. The title is How Communities Can Build Back Better While Not Slowing Down. So we've been talking a lot about what's really important right now is speed and being able to handle the permitting and the construction, all of that, which is really important. But in this discussion, we haven't been talking enough about planning. And even while going fast, while doing all these things as fast as possible, where are the opportunities for making things better? So we're going to have Lori Johnson, FAICP, and Jennifer Gray Thompson from After the Fire, which Pete mentioned the great work they've been doing. And between the two of them, they've had experience in just a huge amount of disaster reconstruction cases. And Jennifer has been going to every fire in the Western US the last couple of years. And they're both going to be able to speak from this experience to emphasize opportunities for betterment with examples that were driven by the needs of the communities themselves. And this is, again, a really important way that planners can be involved, and all the things we were talking about today, and maximizing the chances to take advantage of the opportunities for positive change as part of the reconstruction.
Fantastic, Rob. So that'll be on March 7th. So a month from 4 weeks from today. Both of those happen to be true in February. Right. And then Carrie, did you want to sort of tell us a little bit about what's coming?
What's coming is March 7th. So excited about that. Yes. Thanks. And I do want to just sort of in closing, thank Pete. I remember when we heard about you losing your home, and I remember thinking, how is that possible? It's a neighbor, how is that possible? And now, unfortunately, we know all too well that it's happening more and more. And I think all the links and the chat and the questions and Eric DeCock's article the other day. I mean, I think there's so much incredible reference material, lessons learned that Jeff and Pete have provided. So I really thank the community. I feel like we're really coming out and showing up for each other, and I appreciate that. And there's more to come. I know that we've had some requests to do some public interviews, podcasts and such. And I think we're trying to be very, not just tentative, but we really want to have all the information, and these fact gathering and information gathering is providing a lot of great resources out there. So just on behalf of APA California and the California Planning Roundtable, this is fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, very much. And Miguel, can you tell us a few words about what's coming up on the 21st, just 2 weeks from today?
Of course, thank you so much, Mark and Carrie. I am working on organizing a webinar around the response from our public health community. So more information will be announced very soon, hopefully next week, so that you can all plan to hopefully attend. I wanted to reemphasize that the webinars are planned for every 2 weeks, and we will be doing this on Fridays at 2 p.m. Until we run out of content. But I think it may be a little bit of a while before that happens, because there is so much for us to share, and I believe the lessons that we're bringing forward will not only assist our planners in the LA area, but anywhere else in the state of California and beyond. So
It really is the case, Miguel, that for most of us, if we haven't been impacted by this yet, we will as professionals. And I don't think the profession has spent enough of its resources on how do we do our job during this time period in disaster recovery, because as Rob talked about, there are some opportunities even as we go fast and be effective and efficient. There are some things that we can do. And the more we have training driven down into all the folks who are on the front line and who are leading departments throughout the state, the better off we will be. So, Pete, do you have any closing thoughts here before we wrap up this afternoon?
I think I talked enough.
Very good. So the one thing that, I think for all of us to take away, especially from today, is to be thinking about the fact that as we're rebuilding, we need to be rebuilding communities that will be impacted by exactly this kind of disaster again. The fire will come again. And so each of our decisions today need to be informed with that information. How we rebuild matters. How we make improvement matters. I'm looking forward to, Miguel, both your session in a couple of weeks talking about the mental health aspects of that, because we ignore that at our peril as a profession. We do need to take care of ourselves. If you are a supervisor, you need to make sure that even your big dogs, the ones who have been volunteering again and again to be out there at the front line of this dealing with the public, get the rest they need and the self-care they need. That's your job, to take care of those folks in this particular situation. And especially those who are not only working 16-hour days, but have lost their own home. That's very destabilizing. That impacts people at a very direct level. And so watch for those things. Listen to yourselves as you're going through this, going through it. And don't ignore that. Don't ignore those impacts on your staff either. We can't do our jobs effectively if we're not able to remain healthy mentally. And Miguel, next in 2 weeks, we'll hear more about that. That's fantastic. And Rob, in 4 weeks, looking forward to your session as well. So thank you all, everybody, and thank everybody who stayed with us. And if you know of anybody who wants to take a look at this, these are going to be up in just a bit on the website. So check back in on there. So thank you guys all, and you have a great weekend.